Hey, it's Aaron from Self-Actualization Systems, and as you probably guessed from the name of the video, from the title of this video, I've done over 2,300 hours of meditation. Just before this video, I sat down and I crunched the numbers. I think I've done a bit more than that, but I don't want to be disingenuous. That would be contrary to the spirit of this channel, just in case I have miscalculated. And what this video is going to be about, it's going to be a bit more raw. I'm going to keep the editing to a minimum. It's going to be a longer, slower paced video about what you can actually expect to find when it comes to the benefits of meditation in your self-actualization journey. So it's going to be broken down into 5 parts. There's actually 6 because there's a bonus at the end, or kind of bonus part, which ties it all together. I'm not just putting it at the end arbitrarily. But the first part will be just a little bit of context about why I got into this, what called me to it, my story, that kind of thing. Second one will be the first phase of my meditation journey with one of my mentors. The second part, or the third part of the video, will be about the most transformative experience I had in my meditation journey thus far. The fourth part will be also to do with meditation, but from a different lens, from a different perspective, with one of my mentors around shadow work and what I unlocked in the spiritual aspect through shadow work, through psychology, which usually isn't linked too much for spirituality. For whatever reason, in the self-actualization circles, they're usually seen as very separate things, and they are in some cases. And the fifth part is actually the most important, which will be the conclusion and what it means for you and your journey, what it is, all the lessons I learned, all the drawbacks, all of the things that you could have done better. And then there'll be the sixth part, which is the bonus, which will be a little bit more about how to personalize and tailor the lessons that I learned from my journey to you. So the first part is, how did I get into this? Well, I've always kind of had a calling to, when it comes to the spiritual systems, the more Buddhist spiritual system. I know some people have it with Christianity more, or they might have it with Sufism and Islam, or they might have it with Hindu. For me, it was always Buddhism, because for whatever reason I was surrounded by people who were Buddhists or who were Buddhist adjacent. I also lived in an area of London which is right next to the London Buddhist Centre, and I always saw that growing up and walking around, and the people there were really friendly. So I always had this kind of leaning towards it, and I liked the idea of meditation. I actually liked it because of the samurai and because of the warrior Shaolin monks, because I was, very much into Muay Thai. I was actually a little bit into Kung Fu as well, although not as much. It was mainly Muay Thai. Then obviously I started my Jiu-Jitsu journey, and I liked it for the warrior aspects of it. At this part, if you've ever read the book, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, I was very much into the warrior archetype of this, probably like a lot of young guys in our society. And that's why I wanted to learn meditation, not because I necessarily cared that much about meditation, but because I thought it would make you a better fighter. I liked the romantic kind of martial arts perspective of it, okay? But I started to come into contact with it in a very real way, because when I was competing in Jiu-Jitsu, also in Muay Thai, and although Muay Thai was much, much, much less competitive, just a few burner fights I went into, really, I realized that my mind was not my friend. Okay, and at the time I didn't have the full scope of self-actualization. All I knew about self-actualization was meditation, calms your mind, calms your thoughts, all that kind of stuff. So I started to become more into it through that. I started with Headspace when Headspace first was coming up out of the ground. I think it was around 2020 or 2021. Couldn't even sit for 3 minutes. Can you imagine that, guys? I couldn't even sit for 3 minutes. I had to put on a timer for 3 minutes and my mind would just be going crazy. And then I slowly worked myself up to 5 minutes, then to 10 minutes. And then when I hit 20 minutes, that was like crazy for me, right? But it was all through these kind of apps, these free apps that were, I actually ended up paying a little bit of a subscription money to Headspace actually to get some of the meditations, but it was still a very guided meditation, a very easy meditation. I felt some benefits from it, and it just wasn't quite clicking, which leads me to the second point. My mentor I was working with at the time, or I was following at the time, Pierre de Souza, I mention him all the time, he was going through a very, very deep spiritual transformation, but it was much more Hindu, Advaita stuff. So actually, the first phase of my meditation journey was through a practice called self-inquiry, right? If you go onto YouTube right now and you type in, who am I, self-inquiry guided meditation, I think there's a 2-hour meditation, which I used to listen to daily or every other day. Actually, no, daily, but I wouldn't do the whole 2-hour meditation at once. And this is what one of the main vehicles that one of my first meditation practices happened. You know, Pierre recommended us this. I was part of this kind of group that he was running. And essentially what you do in this style of meditation is you are asking yourself the questions about who is the nature of me? Who is the nature of not my thinking mind, but the thing that watches my thinking mind? Because you can watch your thinking mind, which means that the same way that you cannot watch your own body unless you go to a mirror, right? That means that this is your body, right? But if you can watch your thinking mind, it means that you are something bigger than your thinking mind. So you ask questions such as, who am I? How am I? What am I? What is this that is asking me, that is asking the question? And the meditation, at least that guided meditation, was you just keep on listening to those insights and allowing your mind to think about it. But then I started going away from the guided meditations as Pierre instructed, and you would just sit for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, and you would ask yourself a single question, or you would start off with a single question, and you would go through a chain of questions that lead from that question. So an example would be like, what am I? And like, I am that watches. But who is watching would be like another question or something. So with this meditation, it's actually very kind of cognitive. It's very, in some ways you could class it as thinking, although you're actually watching your thoughts, but you are actually doing something active, right? It comes from the Hindu practice, like I said, Advaita Vedanta, which I believe is the jnana form of yoga, the path of insight, or the path of self-inquiry. And the benefits of this were it gets you into very, very deep altered states of consciousness, whatever you want to call that. You almost like drug-induced states, right? Like if you've ever been super drunk on alcohol, if you smoked weed or done anything else, right? You can actually get to very, very powerful experiences through this meditation like that, which you really feel like, whoa, this is really different. And that was cool because it really opened me up. It opened me up to the experience of what you can actually do with your mind and how malleable your subjective experience of reality actually is. And this was super, super, super cool. However, the drawbacks of this kind of meditation was it's a very, very fleeting state, right? It's hard to maintain throughout the day, and it doesn't actually lead to a stage experience change. What I mean by stage experience is your lived experience that you are living right now, right? So in your self-actualization journey, if you're doing it properly, hopefully you are, it means that if you were to look back 2 years ago, your baseline state, without you having to do anything, without you having to do a morning routine or go into meditation or anything like that, is night and day difference to how you were before. That's the whole goal of it, right? You don't have to be doing anything. People who are just feeling good are not just doing stuff. With this meditation, it's a little bit tough, which is why in this first phase, we moved on to other forms of meditation. We did classic Vipassana, which is another insight meditation. We moved from the Hindu stuff to the Buddhist stuff because there's an insight there which pierces deeper, which is a lot of the goal of Advaita Vedanta was to be in that state, to be in like a kind of a more enlightened, really, really blissful state. Whereas the goal with Buddhist meditation is that you realize the nature of suffering. And when you realize the nature of suffering, you are liberated from it, right? So there's a difference in goals there, which is why we started to lean more and more to that. So read the book Hardcore Teachings of the Buddha. There's also the Insight Manual, which I read, which was written by, I forget his name, right, but Mahasi Sayadaw, or at least I read the shorthand version of that, I'm pretty sure. And we started to go into these more kind of Buddhist practices. So this is your classic body scan Vipassana meditation. And then this is the Anapana breathing, which is when you just focus on the breath in your nostrils, the sensation of that. That's a concentration practice. The difference between concentration and insight practice is one gets you the state. So the concentration practice gets you go through the jhanas and through the states. Jhana is just a word for like the Buddhist way they categorize like different states. Different levels in the human experience that you can exist at. And there's 8 different jhanas. A little bit like the Advaita stuff, a little bit like the Hindu stuff. But it's the Vipassana practice, it's the insight practice, which actually gets you the insights and the deeper realization and the liberation of suffering. Okay, so I did a few hundred hours of all of these, but I did a few hundred hours of the Mahasi noting style practice, which was a big, big one that me and Pierre were doing together, which is essentially you are narrating your experience. So your awareness is on your awareness, just on your mind, what's coming up in your mind. And whenever you are doing something, you are noting that. So right now, I'm touching my nose, right? Or I'm touching touching myself. I have the sensation of touch. So if I was doing the meditation, I would be noting in my mind, touch, touch, touch. Like I said, this comes from Mahasi Sayadaw. It's thought to be one of the last known arahats that's ever supposed to live, or if you want to believe in that kind of classification. For those of you that don't know, arahat is a fully enlightened person in the model of Buddhism, and Theravada Buddhism is the tradition that Mahasi Sayadaw was in. I also did Vipassana. I did a meditation retreat with Vipassana, which is body scanning, which both are good, but I found that the Mahasi noting practice was much deeper, much more nuanced, and you could bring it into a more kind of day-to-day practice, or you could bring both of them into a day-to-day practice much easier. When I say day-to-day practice, I mean like if I had to meditate right now or speaking to the camera, I would be able to do those much easier than the self-inquiry practice beforehand. Okay, now the benefits of this, like I said, it's much easier. There's less of a divide between meditation and life, because if you're living your life, you can still do Vipassana practice. However, there is still too much of a force on the mind. Your mind becomes much sharper. Your mind becomes much more focused, which sounds like a good thing. Like so many of the productivity bros probably are listening to this, if there are any productivity bros, like, oh, that sounds really good. The problem is that your mind, you need to have a relaxed zest. This is what's very clear if you read the suttas, right? There's no forcing. There's no extra, there's no like really hard focus, right? However, with a lot of the Theravada Buddhism meditations nowadays, like Vipassana, like Mahasi Sayadaw noting practice, especially if you read the Hardcore Teachings of the Buddha by Dan Ingram, there's a lot of force in that, it makes your mind very sharp, and in some ways very fragile, because you're using so much force to maintain your mindfulness. That's the problem here, which takes a lot of extra unnecessary energy, okay? And also it slows down your process as well. Like there's that old saying, like slow is smooth is fast. Well, it's true, especially true when it comes to modifying your subjective experience, when it comes to having it fit into all of the other things you're doing as your self-actualization practice, which you should be doing other than meditation, because that's how you actually become a whole multidimensional person who's healthy and who's able to live life in a much more effortless and easy flow. That's the problems. The benefits of it, though, is I started to understand the nature of how I was creating my own suffering much more than the Advaita stuff and the Hindu stuff I was doing beforehand. I also did a little bit of Bhakti, which is like the practice of devotion in the first phase with one of my other kind of semi-mentors, Thomas Wingham. But again, I didn't really do enough of it to really comment on that, and I haven't included it into the number of hours that I've meditated, that I kind of calculated before it. But that's actually a very good practice, a very loving practice that you can bring into a day-to-day life that's much more easy. However, I still don't think it's the end-all be-all, right? But to move back onto what are the benefits I got from the more strict Theravadan practices, it gave me a lot more mindfulness as well than the self-inquiry. It gave me just a lot more of the qualities that you develop in meditation, like focus, like being a little bit more calm, like having a bit more dispassion towards what is coming up within yourself was much easier. And the other thing that this method doesn't include is it's not very integral. It doesn't transcend and include psychology, or it doesn't transcend and include shadows. This is the same for all of the meditation, by the way, just to give you a spoiler, right? But if you're expecting the system to do the work for you and to include all these other things for you, it's not going to do that. You have to be the person that organizes all of this together, okay? And there's a third kind of part of meditation that I did, with Pierre's guidance, although I didn't really do that much of it. Again, so I haven't included it into the 2,300 hours that I've meditated. But it's Dzogchen, or open sky meditation. And when I did this, I would actually get quite blissful states, and it was quite easy to access when walking around. But again, it had the same problem, which is just too much focus, it's too much tension on the mind. So it can actually end up making you feel worse if you're already pre-inclined to be a bit of a hard worker, be a bit of someone who is more disciplined. I was doing jiu-jitsu full time at the same time, So I used all of the same kind of focus that you would use as an athlete into my meditation practice, which actually just led to a less pleasant state coming up at the end of these kind of practices. It was just a very kind of hard practice. My mind felt hard, it felt very finicky, and in some ways it felt much more fragile. That's the drawback of all of this, which leads to a story I'm going to tell you. So I was kind of in the middle of all of this, doing all these practices, and we just kind of heard of a practice called metta meditation. Also, I should probably explain what Dzogchen meditation actually is before I get into the story, which is, it's a practice where you look at a point, and when you're looking at that point, you're seeing the whole big picture at the same time. So I'm doing it right now. So it creates an open sky field of vision, and then that's your focus. And whatever comes in and distracts you, you just pull your mind back, right? That's a very kind of simplified version of it. So that's what Dzogchen practice is, to give you some context. But like I said, I'm going to tell you a story right now, which leads to the second part of this, or the third part of this rather, the second part of my meditation journey, but the third part of this video in general, which was, I was sitting down in my garden. I was a little bit burnt out from meditation, from doing this, the Mahasi style noting and the Vipassana, because it's just, my mind was just very, very hard. And I told this to Pierre, and he just discovered this practice called metta meditation. It's also written about in the Hardcore Teachings of the Buddha, and it's kind of mentioned a little bit here and there in just like Theravadan literature. For whatever reason, it's not really mentioned that much. And metta is the Pali and the Sanskrit word for loving kindness. And they said, and in a lot of the schools, they suggest to kind of use this practice as a very easy way to go to sleep, because it's a very pleasant state to be in, and also just to help you on the path, so the journey doesn't feel as tough, it doesn't feel as forced, it doesn't feel like you're trying to become an athlete, for God's sake. And we kind of viewed it as that. We kind of viewed it as an auxiliary, and our blind spots at the time, or my blind spot at the time, rather, I don't want to speak for Pierre, was to be very much that kind of push person, right? Probably relates to some of you watching this. Just wanted to get the results as fast as possible. But he was like, hey, Aaron, maybe you should try this practice. It's going pretty well for me. And it's really helped my mind and my overall state of being much, much more than the other practices. I'm still going to go back to the other practices, but maybe you can do this as just a separate thing. So I was like, all right, cool. And I was combining Dzogchen meditation, which is the open sky meditation I just talked about, where you are looking at the whole picture at the same time, was picking a specific spot, and I was radiating the feeling of metta in my chest, just to myself and just to the world in general. And when I was sitting there for about 20-30 minutes, and this meditation, I've never had this experience since or after, so it's hard to tell what it actually was, but it was the craziest experience I've ever had in my life during meditation, by far. I started to be able to see vibrations. I know that all like they're like super woo-woo people talk about vibrations, but I was actually seeing the vibrations in the air and on the wall. And when you do open sky meditations, you kind of see vibrations a little bit, right? But really what it is just your eyes like flickering. I think is what it is. It's like your eyes flickering, or because you're just looking at a spot for a bit, like your vision just becomes a little bit blurry. It wasn't like that. Let me just be very clear. It was not this experience. It was like I was looking around like this, and there was just like vibrations and different like refractions of light and all that kind of stuff from this metta meditation. Like I said, I'm not trying to say that it was, like I was on DMT or anything like that, but it was so much of a powerful experience that it led me to question a lot of different things. Or it didn't lead me to question a lot of different things. That happened so effortlessly, and my mind felt so good and my body felt so good. It was a real kind of prelude to what was going to come after, right? Now, to those of you listening like, oh, I want to experience that state or whatever, it's still a subjective state. It's not like I'm saying that the world is actually vibrating and there's all these energies. There might be, right? Who knows? But I don't actually know. It's not very scientific to say after one experience. It just happened one time. But more importantly, even if that is really real, it didn't actually change too much of how I viewed reality. It kind of opened me up. It told me what was possible. I saw what was possible. But in terms of actually understanding the nature of how my reality is created, the nature of how suffering is created, and how to alleviate myself from that burden, it didn't actually teach me that much. It was actually in my more boring meditations, my more boring sets, 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, where nothing really happened, that after I was actually able to digest the insights I got from those practices, and that actually led to much, much more lasting, permanent change. So if you are grading yourself on how crazy the meditation experience or how crazy your spiritual experiences are, that's the wrong criteria. If this is what you're trying to do, which if you're at self-actualization systems, I would assume that you actually want to create permanent, lasting, somewhat effortless change that's going to affect you your whole life and not just have a crazy experience that lasts 5 minutes and you don't really get anything from. And like I always say, if that kind of message sounds really interesting to you, I have my one-on-one link below. But like I said, it leads to the third part of this video, which is meeting alongside Pierre, my other really, really influential mentor, Sister Kante Khema, Sasana Dipika. So I was still trying to become an athlete. I just competed at the World Championships. I didn't win. A couple years before, or a year before, I competed at the Euros. I got 3rd place. And it seemed like my career was just beginning to like really kick into gear in terms of I was probably going to start competing quite a lot more, get a lot more wins, get a lot more losses, and just kind of really start taking it seriously. But for a year before this, because I was doing all of this self-actualization, not just the meditation, but the things outside of it, which we'll get to in a minute, I just felt really burnt out of jiu-jitsu because the person who started the jiu-jitsu career, it was not the person who was finishing it, if that makes any sense. And I was kind of, my heart wasn't into it the last year. The World Championships was the thing that actually motivated me, and I was really into the training, all that kind of stuff. And then it happened, and I was like, is this it? Didn't have anything, like, had absolutely zero to do with the result. I wasn't disheartened at all by the result because I actually put on a good performance. And more importantly, all of this self-actualization was kicking into gear because it's the best I felt in any competition ever, internally, and also just readiness for it. So it wasn't like there was a problem with that happening. It was more like I got there, it was exciting, it was novel, and that was it. So the thing that I was building it into, like, oh, this is going to be my life's purpose, all of this kind of stuff, it just didn't live up to that. And it was a really sobering reality. Now, at the time, Pierre was kind of opening his business up. One of my good friends, Cameron, was already living with Pierre as a one-on-one apprentice, a one-on-one mentee. And I wanted to go see them. They were living in Poland at the time, and I was going to go see them originally for 10 days, right? I booked for 10 days. And they were with the teacher, Sister Khema, or my teacher, Sister Khema, and I'd had a few calls with her, and she had introduced us to the new form of meditation, which is where was my bread and butter. I've got most of my thousands of hours with this, or the majority of my thousands of hours of this, and it is the Tranquil Wisdom Insight Meditation from Dharma Sukha in America. And what it is a metta meditation which combines both the concentration practice and the insight practice together, so that your ride to enlightenment, or whatever you want to call it, is just much, much smoother, because you are doing it through the vehicle of metta meditation, through the vehicle of something called Brahma Viharas. There's 4 Brahma Viharas. The first one is metta, we've already talked about that. Then this opens up and becomes much, much more subtle, and it becomes karuna, which is compassion. The third one is mudita, which is a state of altruistic joy. You can think of this as the healthy version of excitement. Not the excitement that brings craving, but just the joy of life that you have when you start to take it less seriously. That's what that state is. It's a really cool state. It's also the state which I spent the least in out of these 4. And the 4th one, which I spent the most in alongside metta, is a really, really important state, probably the missing link to most people's self-actualization journeys, which is upekkha, otherwise known as equanimity. You can view that as tranquility, you can view that as inner peace, but equanimity is essentially you're okay with not being okay. And you're okay with being okay. You don't cling to that either. So you go through the 4 Brahma Viharas, and then that's combined with you also falling through deeper and deeper into the jhanic states. But it's a little bit different because while the jhanic states in concentration practice are you are fully submerged in that, you are just trying to get the state. So much so that apparently there's been stories of monks so deep in that state that you can like move them and move their arms and they don't realize it because their mind is just so focused on that. Again, laser focused mind starts going like that, starts becoming hard and heavy and sharp. Better not cut yourself. It's much more, it's like an insight jhana state where it's much more open. You get the benefits of being in a concentration state. The benefits of being in a concentration state are the fact that it's much, much more pleasant to be in, which means it's easier for you to stay and sit longer, and therefore it's easier for you to generate insights or have insights about the nature of suffering, which leads you closer and closer to the final realization, which is to end suffering or end suffering for yourself. So this was the practice that was my bread and butter. And this is what had been introduced to me, but it really kicked into gear when I moved. When I was only supposed to go there for 10 days for a holiday, I said to all the jiu-jitsu guys, yeah, I'm just supposed to go 10 days as a break, I'll be back. First day I got there, I was like, this is where I need to be. And I became a coach for Pierre. And I was basically like a live-in apprentice. So I was expected to sit for about 90 minutes to 3 hours a day, every day, for a year and a half, until Sister Kema passed away. That's another part of the journey, because as soon as she got to Poland, we took her for some checkups, or the boys took her for some checkups, and she had stage 4 cancer. She got diagnosed with stage 4 bone cancer, I think is the cancer, but don't quote me on that. And it was just a process of taking her to hospitals, hospices, looking after her, all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, she was teaching us the Dharma every single day. And when I say the Dharma, she taught us where they got this metta meditation from. Apparently metta is mentioned over 100 times in the original suttas, which by the way is the original Dharma talks of the Buddha, if you want to know about the history. So it's a practice that's much, much closer to what was taught at the time of the Buddha, because they have a lot of extensive sources. I'm not sure how credible those sources are, or if they were written after the death of the Buddha, but supposedly they're supposed to be the original teachings of the Buddha. The suttas are supposed to be the original teachings of the Buddhas, his Dharma talks, so to speak. So, what is so amazing about this method, and it's something that I still teach my clients now, is state cultivation and something called the relaxed step. Like I said, there was a pattern with all of the other meditations, which was, makes your mind like this, makes your mind too hard. What Twim saw, because if you read the suttas, it's very, very clear that your mind should be relaxed. It's a very easy practice, light practice, is there needs to be a relaxed step when people come back to the object of meditation. The goal of meditation is not to stay on the object. That's just like a way you focus your mind. Your goal is to see how mind's attention moves. So a big part of the meditation is getting distracted by thoughts, realizing that your mind's attention has moved, and then placing it back onto the object. And you need to have the relaxed step with that. Otherwise, it creates so much tension in the mind that it becomes detrimental to the practice. This is what is so phenomenal about this practice. It means that the mind going like this is much, much, much less likely to happen. It means you can actually practice for much longer because your mind hurts less as well. And like I said, the state cultivation is so important, because if you read Ken Wilber, it's very clear, states into traits. And you can actually try this in your own life, right? What so many self-actualization channels get wrong is they try to copy somebody who's confident, or they try to copy somebody who's this with the traits first. Oh, this person acts like this. Let me copy their behaviors and then I'll be like that. Problem is, you might fool people, you might even fool yourself, or you can never really fool yourself. You might fool people into thinking that you're this person or that person through behaviors, but internally, people still feel like a little boy. They still feel like a little girl. They still feel like that person 5 years ago when their crush said no and laughed at them in their face. Or when their parents said they could never be someone. They still feel the same way because they're trying to go traits into states. You have to go the other way around. You have to be in the state first. This is also what Tony Robbins talks about. He also gets it from Ken Wilber, because Ken Wilber is one of his big mentors, is you have to be in that state. And what metta does is it allows you to be in a state of loving kindness, a state of compassion, a state of joy, and a state of inner peace, of equanimity. If you have all of these 4 states developed in you, how do you think that's going to impact your behavior as a person? It's going to make you more confident, more trustworthy, more loving. You're going to be more pleasant to be around and more pleasant to be with as your person, because you're always with yourself. And it's going to bleed into all different areas of your life. This is what makes this practice so phenomenal. It changes you as a person. It transforms you as a person. And that's just the state practice. That's not even the point of the meditation. And then it allows you to train mindfulness, train all of the 7 enlightenment factors in a way that's very easy, very sustainable. And when things are very easy and very sustainable, they also become very fast. So it's also the fastest practice to insight that I've ever had. However, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. And what is not all sunshine and rainbows about this is it's still not integral. It's still not a meta system. It's not a system that we can plug other things into. We have to transcend it as a teaching system and include things in other ways. So what does that mean? It means, doesn't include shadow work, doesn't include becoming a more mature, healthy perspective taker necessarily, and it doesn't actually give us the tools, if we don't have them already, to go after what we want in this real life, because it's still, like a lot of spiritual systems, can lead to spiritual bypassing. It can still lead to not owning the world as it is, unfortunately. But it's very easy to counteract, because that's what this channel is for, and what other channels are as well, I guess, which is I take care of the meta system for you. I take care of the systems for you, and this is plugged into that system. However, if we're trying to live our life just through this one system, through this strain of Theravada Buddhism, our life is not going to be multi-dimensional. It's just going to be one faceted, one dimension, unfortunately, right? However, as a practice, it is phenomenal. Which leads to the 4th part of this video, which is discovering my other mentor, Kim Barter, discovering how shadow work can lead to state cultivation, state creation, permanent, lasting transformation, and how it has a spirit aspect. So Kim used to call it shadow to spirit. It's a little bit different from what we've talked about. So I've talked about strict Hindu and Theravada Buddhist practice, although Dzogchen is more Mahayana, and Zen, I think, is Vajrayana. So it's a little bit different, but it's still Buddhist and Hindu, like classical practices, right? This is where the psychology and the shadow work comes in. So if you release a shadow and you do an embodiment practice around where this area was, this shadow was, that can lead to you getting a spiritual state. The reason this is going to be a little bit of a shorter section, because it's not a straight up meditation practice. I didn't even include it in the 2,300 hours either. So, if I was being more liberal, I could include all the hours I did that. But as well as all the other internal work, it'd probably like double this number if I think about it. But it's not a meditation practice. However, what it is super important for, and why I'm mentioning this, is because this was the key for me to realize how the relative self can be included and is actually the same, or not the same, but included into the absolute self. And we don't have to push down the relative self in order to attain the absolute self. They actually work hand in hand. So for those of you that don't know, meditation trains the absolute self, if you want to call it training, right? What the absolute self is, the watcher that watches all things, the consciousness that watches all of this, all of Aaron, all of you move, talk, and interact with the world. The relative self is the personality of Aaron, or the personality of Jacob or Susan or whoever it is that's watching this, right? That's what the relative self is. If you're not careful, a lot of the meditation practices can lead to you disowning your personality a little bit, and also other people's personalities. This, for obvious reasons, is not very functional in the real world. Why is it not really functional in the real world? It's not really functional in the real world because it means we can disown the problems that we are experiencing by just going to the absolute self, being like, oh yeah, well, it's all meaningless anyway. A little bit nihilism, right? Oh yeah, like I made that person feel bad and I acted a bit cruel, but it's not a problem because in the absolute sense, none of this matters, right? It's very easy to do that through these thousands of hours of meditations, and it's something that I felt myself doing very subtly, despite having all of the teachers pointing out that this was going to happen. So if someone didn't have the fortune that I had with mentors, it's very easy for them to fall into nihilism, and if not nihilism, the ability to just bypass problems that are happening in their life. Okay, which is why the shadow work is so important. The shadow work kind of embodiment practice, which is their version of meditation, is so key to understanding this whole picture, which leads to the fifth, and like I said, the most important, which is the conclusions from these videos. What is it that you can learn from my journey? Okay, what is the big picture principles that I learned? The big picture principles that I learned really boils down to this. It boils down to the quality of your life is determined and dictated by how you are using your mind. Now, I know a lot of people say that, but hopefully from this story that I've given you and all the hours that I've given you, it kind of hits a little bit differently, because the way I want it to hit is, yes, there are certain objective structures in the world or subjective structures in the world that we all kind of agree on that might be holding us back. Okay? But when it comes to our subjective experience, we have so much control over how we can experience that. So much control. And then usually when we are experiencing a subjective experience differently, our objective experience changes from that, because we are taking off the limitations and the shackles we have placed on ourselves. That's what a lot of shadow work is. But the meditational aspect, what the benefits that I felt from that is I was able to make much clearer decisions. I was able to know what it is that I actually wanted, like that. I don't have to check in with myself. I had the mindfulness to know what I want most of the time. The other part is it makes your focus and your attention much clearer. Like after doing a few hundred hours of meditation, I was able to sit and do work for like 10 hours a day if I really needed to. And I was doing that or 10 hours, 12 hours a day. And I was doing that because I was training for about 6 to 8 hours, and I had to do a sales job, which was a lead gen. What was it called again? I can't remember what it's called. A sales job, which was basically I generated leads for my clients or the people that I was working for, and then they would close them, right? So I had to, and that was the very mind. And these things take a lot of energy, but I was able to have so much more energy and focus. And the reason why is because your mind isn't going to like random places. It's not using a certain amount of a certain amount of data or a certain amount of RAM on random stuff. You're just much more focused. It's like opening up your computer and just having one tab open and just working from there. It's just much smoother, much more efficient. There's less bandwidth required, there's less RAM required, there's less internet connection required. So it's not like you're generating more energy, it's just the energy that you already have is becoming much more streamlined. I was also much less reactive to my emotions, much less reactive to my thoughts. I created much less storylines, and I still do create much storylines around what Aaron means as a person. It's just at least for me, a functional facade which just happens. It's just part of the mind's existence. The same way that when you look with eyes, you just see. When you have a mind, you just have a personality. And it's just an amalgamation, it's just a collection of experiences. And also I think that your genes hold some kind of, they also dictate what kind of leanings you're going to have, and then your subjective experiences either make those stronger or they make those weaker, right? And the other thing that I really noticed from meditation is I was able to connect much more with people, because now I was able to stop identifying so much with the facade of Aaron. My stuff became less important, and I started to become interested much more in other people, because all of this was no longer distracting me. And the connection in front of me, I was able to connect much deeper in, much more in a much more genuine way. And also I was able to not be pulled into other people's drama. This is another big one, because if I'm no longer getting pulled into my own drama, which if you guys are doing a strict meditation practice, which is going to start to happen to you, then it becomes so much easier to not get pulled into other people's drama. Or I'm in Mexico at the moment, or the word here is chisme, right? I don't get pulled into gossip. It just doesn't have the same weight or effect onto me, which means that my emotional turbulence has decreased to almost like a zero level. It's not fully zero, but it's so low. Another thing that's really key, and that the benefits that I've found, is become much less held back by emotions like fear. because fear is a subjective experience created by ourselves most of the time. Now, if I'm getting chased through a jungle by a jaguar, that's when fear is actually very, very healthy. But the problem is that most of us aren't in that kind of a situation. So this is what I meant by making clearer decisions. You just are much, much less affected by subjective things. And as objectively as possible, you're able to make decisions that are for the betterment of yourself. And then I think this leads to the final part. I could go on for ages around the benefits, which is you're able to have a much, much more longer time horizon, much longer time horizon, which means that you're able to plan more efficiently to where you want to go in life. So if you've developed a longer time horizon, you can kind of think of it about having a much clearer idea on what your North Star is. And when you know what your North Star is, it's almost like your gravitational energy, your gravitational pull changes, because you become much more certain in yourself. Other people become much more certain in you too. And then you also, this is when you start connecting and collaborating with people who also have that more, because you're now on the same wavelength as them. But like I said, there's a bonus here for you. And that bonus is, what can you take from this? What I hope you take from this, first of all, I recommend you to go and do TWIM. I get a real basis in that. But you need to remember that meditation, whilst amazing, has been around for how many thousands of years, it's not a golden bullet. It's not a golden pill. It's not going to get you where you're going. It needs to be used in tandem with the rest of what self-actualization offers, like with shadow work or like with understanding big picture systems. So you no longer fall into the trap of being trapped in the system of just meditation and then discerning maybe your goals in life and maybe you want to get, a romantic relationship and you don't really know how to socialize. You can still work on all of this and meditation, and it's all linked together whilst the systems of spirituality and meditation are not the autocrat. They're not the decider. We're the ones that actually have to make our own system. Okay? So if you're looking at meditation like a save all be all, or it's going to save everything, that's not what you're going to find. What you're actually going to find is a massively powerful tool, which is a gift that keeps on giving. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to need some structure. You're going to have to need some strategy about how to apply that to all different areas of life. So that's the video. Hopefully that was interesting to you. That was kind of a bulletproof guide to a little bit my journey and all the stuff that happened. I could go into way more detail. Hopefully you enjoyed.